The conference room fell into a heavy silence as Richard Graham approached the podium. His fingers clenched around its edges, his knuckles going white as he scanned the sea of skeptical faces. Behind them, the floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline, bathed in the golden light of late summer. It was a view Richard knew would soon be gone forever, exactly 73 days from now. He took a steadying breath, his pulse racing as he began. "The first wave will hit," he said, his voice calm despite the turmoil in his chest. "Not tsunamis, not floods, but cold. Unprecedented cold." Dr. Lila Crane, seated at the front of the room, wore her usual expression of polite disapproval. "Mr. Graham, these climate models you're proposing contradict fundamental scientific principles." "Forget the models," Richard cut in, pulling up a satellite image of the Arctic anomaly on the massive screen. "This is not a temporary occurrence. It's the start of a cascade that will plunge global temperatures by 40 degrees in less than 3 months. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A man in a sharp suit stood up. Richard recognized him as the head of the Global Climate Initiative. "And how do you know this?" he asked. Richard had rehearsed this moment countless times, but the words still choked him. How could he tell them that he had already lived through the apocalypse they were about to dismiss? "The data is right in front of you," he replied, pointing to the screen. "The magnetic field distortions, the stratospheric cooling. These aren't just theoretical possibilities." Dr. Crane interrupted. "Nothing supports the doomsday scenario you're describing." Richard barely stifled a bitter laugh. In 6 months, she would freeze to death trying to reach her family in Boston. He shook his head. "Look," he said, pulling up another slide. "These temperature projections." The GCI head raised his hand. "I think we've heard enough." This panel was assembled to discuss practical climate mitigation strategies, not entertain apocalyptic fantasies. As the room emptied, Richard stood alone at the podium, staring at his futile data. A young researcher lingered near the door, her expression hesitant. "For what it's worth," she said, "there's something off about the anomaly." Richard forced a tight smile. "What's your name?" "Amelia," she replied. "Amelia Crane, Dr. Crane's daughter." Richard's brow furrowed. "Really?" She glanced nervously at the door. "If you truly believe this, what are you going to do?" "Prepare," Richard said simply, "and try to save as many as I can." Later that night, in his apartment overlooking Central Park, Richard reviewed his supplies for the 100th time. Thermal gear rated for Arctic conditions. Enough preserved food to last months. Weapons for hunting and protection. Medicine. Tools. Everything he'd need when society inevitably collapsed. He pulled up the latest satellite images on his tablet. The anomaly was growing faster than even he had anticipated. Last time, he'd been just another helpless victim. This time, it would be different. His phone buzzed with a news alert about record-breaking summer temperatures. Richard smiled grimly at the irony. In 1 week, those same reporters would be scrambling to explain why snow was falling in September. He walked to the window and pressed his palm against the warm glass. Below him, the city stretched out, oblivious to the disaster that was coming. Millions of people were going about their lives, planning for a future that would never come. "I tried," he whispered to the skyline. "God help me, I tried." 3 days later, the first snowflakes began to fall. It started on a Wednesday morning in September. By Thursday night, Manhattan was buried under 2 feet of snow. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees in just 24 hours. Richard watched from his apartment window as the city descended into chaos. Emergency vehicles wailed in the distance, their sirens muffled by the thickening snowfall. People on the streets struggled through the drifts, still wearing business suits and light jackets, utterly unprepared for winter in late summer. His phone buzzed incessantly with emergency alerts and missed calls from the scientific community that had dismissed him. But Richard ignored them. He was methodically packing his gear into his modified SUV, which he'd prepared months ago. "Right on schedule," he muttered, checking his watch. In exactly 4 hours, the power grid would fail under the strain of millions of desperate heaters. He needed to be well outside the city by then. A crash from the street caught his attention. Looking out through the swirling snow, He saw a group of men breaking into a nearby convenience store. The panic had begun. It was only going to get worse. Richard shouldered his pack and took one last look at his apartment. The place had never felt like home. How could it when he carried the memories of a future that hadn't happened yet? Still, leaving felt final in a way that tightened his chest. The elevator was down, so he took the emergency stairs, hauling 40 pounds of gear down 17 flights. By the 10th floor, he heard shouting. Someone had just learned their heat was out. He emerged into the lobby just as Mrs. Wilson from 3B was arguing with the doorman. "What do you mean the plows can't get through?" "My daughter's at school," she demanded. Richard paused. He remembered what had happened to her daughter in another timeline. He could save her this time, but every second he delayed risked his own survival. "Mrs. Wilson," he called, adjusting his pack. "I'm heading that way." "Which school?" The drive that should have taken 15 minutes stretched into 2 hours. The city was gridlocked with abandoned cars and accidents. Richard navigated carefully, grateful for the oversized tires on his SUV. When he finally delivered the girl, Lucy, to her tearful mother, he didn't stay for their gratitude. The light was fading, and he needed to keep moving. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees as he finally cleared the city limits. The SUV's thermometer read -7 degrees Fahrenheit. Impossible for September, yet there it was. The radio crackled with increasingly frantic reports about the freak storm engulfing the eastern seaboard. Richard knew it wasn't just the East Coast. Within days, the cold would spread worldwide. Only then would the scientists finally understand what he had been trying to warn them about. But by then, it would be far too late. He was heading for a specific location, a remote military bunker he'd scouted months ago. Safe from the desperate masses that would soon flood the cities, but close enough to a place of refuge. Suddenly, something massive moved across the road ahead. Richard slammed on the brakes, the SUV sliding sideways in the snow. In the headlights, he saw a grotesque, hulking figure, 15 feet tall, covered in too many limbs, and with crystalline growth sprouting from its back. "No," he whispered. "They're not supposed to appear for weeks." The creature turned, its body covered in clusters of eyes that reflected the headlights like mirrors. The frost stalkers. They were appearing early this time. The cold was accelerating everything. The creature lunged toward the SUV, its crystalline appendages scraping against the metal with a sound that made Richard's teeth grind. He threw the vehicle into reverse, tires spinning in the thickening snow. The stalker, faster than any creature Richard had ever encountered, kept pace easily, its multiple limbs moving with terrifying speed. Come on," he muttered as the SUV finally found traction. Just as he gained some distance, a flash of purple caught his eye in the trees to the left. At first, he thought it was another stalker, but then he saw something or someone running. The stalker noticed too, pausing its pursuit of Richard as it turned toward the movement. In the harsh glow of the headlights, Richard saw her, a woman wearing a form-fitting suit that looked both alien and practical for the cold. She was stunning, but what struck him most was the sheer terror on her face. "Impossible," he whispered. In all his memories of the future, he'd never encountered anything like her. The frost stalker lunged toward her, and without thinking, Richard spun the SUV around and floored the gas pedal. The woman was fast, inhumanly fast, but the stalker was faster. It would catch her in seconds. "Get in," he shouted through the window. Without hesitation, she yanked open the passenger door and dove inside. Her momentum sent her across the center console, briefly pressing her against Richard before she adjusted herself. Even through his winter gear, he could feel her warmth. "Thank you," she said breathlessly. The SUV roared through the thickening snow. The only sound louder than the howling wind was the relentless growl of the engine as Richard kept the vehicle's wheels spinning through the unrelenting ice. The woman beside him, was still catching her breath, her eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror. The frost stalker, with its many legs and monstrous form, had vanished into the snowstorm's depths, but Richard knew it wouldn't be long before it reappeared. The creatures always did. They hunted relentlessly, especially in the early stages of the cold, when the mutation was at its peak. She was still trembling, her hands clutching the edge of the seat. Richard couldn't quite explain why, but something about her terrified him, more than the monster that had nearly torn his vehicle to pieces. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was striking, even in the dim light of the SUV. It was the raw, alien aura around her, something unfamiliar and unsettling that pricked at his senses. "Oh, who are you?" he asked, his voice strained against the roar of the wind outside. "What are you doing here?" She turned toward him, her violet eyes wide, though he couldn't tell if it was from fear or surprise. I didn't think anyone else would be here," she said, her voice melodic, though it carried an odd accent he couldn't place. "I didn't think the human resistance would survive this long." Richard's mind raced. The resistance? What did she mean? The resistance? He repeated, his thoughts scrambling for context. You're not human?" She shook her head slowly, but there was no malice in her movements, only a deep sorrow. "I am a survivor, but not of your world, not entirely." Richard's heart pounded harder now. "What do you mean?" he pressed, his mind whirling with the implications. She hesitated, clearly weighing her words. "I'm from a place beyond your understanding, from a civilization that once studied your kind. We knew what was coming, the cold, the monsters, the collapse." Her voice cracked slightly. "We tried to warn you, but you didn't listen." Her words hit Richard like a ton of bricks. They knew? He tried to make sense of it, but there was no time for questions now. The storm was worsening, and the creatures would be closing in soon. "Why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you help?" His voice was tinged with disbelief and anger. If they had known, why hadn't they done something sooner? Helped in some way? "I couldn't," she whispered, almost to herself. "Our people, we couldn't interfere directly. The laws of our kind prevent it. But we sent those of us who could. Those like me." Her gaze shifted to the rearview mirror, where the glint of something ominous flickered through the snow. "We are not many, but we are here to help. What's left of you?" Richard's mind raced. He barely registered what she had said, focused only on the world outside. He wasn't sure if it was the cold creeping in through the cracks of the SUV or the realization of how deeply wrong everything had gone, but a cold sweat broke out along his skin. "Hold on," he said, snapping back to focus. "We're not safe yet." His hands gripped the wheel as he maneuvered the SUV around a massive snowdrift, the tires biting into the ice. Behind them, distant shadows moved through the flurry, too large, too fast to be anything but the stalkers. "You said your people sent you here." Richard's voice was quieter now, but it carried a weight. "Why me? Why now? I'm just a scientist." She turned toward him, her face tense as she searched his eyes for a moment. "It's not just you," she said. "It's what you carry." Richard's brow furrowed. "What I carry? The knowledge. You were right. You saw the signs before anyone else." Her words were sharp, insistent. "You're not just a scientist. You're a link, a bridge. You have the knowledge they need to understand what's happening and how to stop it." Richard's pulse quickened. "You're talking about them, your people. What do they want me to do?" The woman's eyes darkened, and Richard could feel the shift in the air between them. It was as if the world itself had paused, waiting for her answer. "They want you to live," she said, her voice cold, distant. "They want you to survive. You are the key to the next phase. You're the only one left who can make it all right. The only one left with the knowledge to save this world." Richard's heart pounded. The pressure of the weight on his shoulders was suffocating. He didn't know what to say. Save the world? How was that even possible when everything was crumbling around him? But before he could ask more, the snow outside seemed to thicken, almost as if the storm itself was breathing in rhythm with the pounding in his chest. "Look," she said urgently, her hand tightening on the door handle. "They're coming. They won't stop. Not until they have us. Not until they have you." The warning came just in time. Through the swirling snow, Richard spotted the shifting shadows again, this time closer. Much closer. He hit the gas, the SUV lurching forward as the massive shape of a stalker loomed into view once more, its many limbs scraping against the frozen ground. Richard cursed under his breath, jerking the wheel to the right, sending the vehicle into a sideways skid. The frost stalker moved with terrifying speed, its limbs stretching out toward them, the icy air seeming to freeze the very space between them. He slammed his foot on the gas, trying to outrun the creature. But the snow was relentless, the visibility near zero, and the road ahead was little more than an icy wasteland. "We need to get to the bunker," Richard said through gritted teeth, desperation creeping into his voice. "It's the only place we'll be safe." The woman nodded once, her skin glinting in the faint light. "Keep going. You're almost there." Her eyes met his, and for the first time since they had met, he saw something other than fear in her gaze, something like hope. Hope! He hadn't seen that in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this hell after all. But as he pushed the SUV forward, the stalker was gaining on them. Richard's mind raced. He had no more time for questions, no time to figure out what this strange woman truly was or what the future held. All that mattered now was survival. The snowstorm had swallowed everything, every landmark, every sign of civilization. The world outside the SUV was a swirling white void, the headlights barely cutting through the blizzard. Richard's fingers gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached, but there was no time to be gentle with himself. Behind him, the frost stalker was relentless. Its shape loomed like a ghost in the rearview mirror, a monstrous blur of limbs and crystalline growths, moving with unnatural precision through the deepening snow. The sound of its limbs scraping against the frozen earth echoed through the vehicle's walls, setting Richard's teeth on edge. The woman beside him, her skin glimmering like a dark jewel in the low light, didn't seem to be afraid of the creature. Instead, her attention was fixed on something ahead. Her eyes, glowing faintly, tracked the endless road that led them toward the military bunker, a haven, if he could make it there. "Faster," she urged, her voice low but insistent. "It's too close." Richard's foot slammed down harder on the gas pedal, the engine roaring in protest as the SUV slewed sideways on the ice. The tires struggled to find grip, the vehicle fighting to stay in control. He was close. They were close. But the stalker wasn't far behind. Its shrill, guttural cries reached his ears, and he could feel the ground beneath them shaking as it pushed forward. "Hold on," he gritted out through clenched teeth, swinging the wheel to the left. The SUV slid at a dangerous angle but kept moving forward, the headlights illuminating the dark shadows of the trees ahead. The only sound now was the rush of wind and the thumping of his heart in his chest. "Just a little further," the woman urged, her voice strangely calm in the midst of the chaos. Her confidence unsettled him. How could she be so certain, so calm? Richard stole a quick glance at her. Her skin glowed faintly under the artificial light, and her eyes, so alien, so haunting, were fixed on the road ahead, not on him or the danger behind them. She seemed at peace. It was both comforting and unnerving. The storm seemed to grow even fiercer, as if nature itself was waging war against them. The snowflakes piled up faster now, obscuring the road entirely. Richard squinted through the windshield, hoping he could make out the faint outlines of the bunker. "There!" she shouted suddenly, pointing toward the tree-line. Richard's heart skipped. There, barely visible in the near whiteout conditions, stood a shadow against the snow, a large, squat structure buried halfway under a thick blanket of snow. He swerved to the right, tires squealing as they hit the snowbank, and the SUV lurched forward. "Almost there," Richard muttered under his breath, not daring to look back at the creature. His hands were slick with sweat despite the cold. As the SUV slammed through the snow and reached the concrete bunker's entrance, he could hear the frost stalker screeching in fury, too close for comfort. "Get inside," he commanded as he threw the SUV into park, his breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. The woman didn't hesitate. In one smooth, fluid motion, she leaped from the passenger seat, her movements graceful and precise. almost as if she were part of the storm itself. She ran toward the bunker entrance, her form blending with the snow as she vanished into the darkness. Richard followed quickly, grabbing his pack and slamming the SUV door shut. The wind howled in his ears, but he didn't look back. He had no time. He reached the heavy steel door and hammered the emergency code into the keypad. There was a sharp, metallic click as the door unlocked, and Richard pushed it open just as the snowstorm screamed in fury behind him. He stumbled into the dark, sterile interior of the bunker. The air was cold but stale, the silence overwhelming after the storm outside. Richard paused, listening for the sound of footsteps, the telltale sign of pursuit. But all he could hear was his own ragged breathing. "Close it," the woman shouted, her voice sharp and urgent. Richard slammed the door shut with all his strength, the heavy metal door groaning as it sealed. The wind and the snow were suddenly muffled, the silence of the bunker enveloping them both. He leaned against the door, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones. The woman was already at the center of the room, moving quickly to a console covered in dust. Her hands danced across the buttons, and lights flickered to life around them. "Do you have any idea what this place is?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse. "Yes," she answered, her voice steady as ever. "This bunker is part of the infrastructure left behind by your military. It was built for this scenario. If the world collapsed, this place was designed to survive. And to protect what's left." Richard nodded, trying to take in her words. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but the adrenaline was fading, leaving him drained. There was still so much he didn't understand, and now wasn't the time to ask. They were inside. They were safe for the moment. The woman turned toward him, her eyes scanning his face with an intensity that almost seemed familiar. She stepped closer, her voice softer this time. "We don't have much time," she said. "The frost stalkers will find us eventually, and the cold will keep getting worse. But I think we can still stop this. We can still save what's left of your world." Richard swallowed hard, still struggling to fully comprehend everything she had said. "How? How do we stop it?" Her violet eyes gleamed with something that might have been hope or a promise. "You've seen the patterns, Richard. You've seen the data. But there's more to it than that. There's something the world doesn't understand about this cold." Richard's thoughts raced. The anomaly, the storm, the creatures. It was all connected, but how? "Do you think the frost stalkers are a result of the cold?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded slowly, her eyes intense. "Yes, they're more than just a byproduct of the temperature drop. They're a manifestation of the imbalance. An invasive species, not from your world." Richard's stomach tightened as he began to understand the gravity of the situation. "So, you're saying we can't just survive it? We have to fix it?" She turned away, her back to him as she moved toward a dusty control panel. "Exactly. And I need your help to do it. You're the only one who can help me finish what was started." Richard stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. They had a chance, but only if they worked together. Only if they could unlock what had been left behind in this forgotten place. The world outside was falling apart, but maybe, just maybe, they could piece it back together. But Richard wasn't sure if he was ready for the cost of that hope. The bunker hummed with an eerie stillness. The harsh winds outside had been reduced to a distant howl, barely audible through the thick concrete walls. Richard stood motionless, his back pressed against the heavy door as the woman, who was still so alien to him, focused on the control panel in front of her. The dim emergency lights flickered above, casting long shadows across the room. There were rows of shelves filled with equipment he didn't recognize, emergency rations stacked in neat boxes, and some kind of bulky machinery along the walls. It looked like a place designed for survival. But survival of what? He had no answers yet, only more questions. The woman, he still didn't know her name, was moving with purpose, her fingers dancing over the buttons, her eyes glowing faintly with an intensity he had never seen in a human before. "Are you sure this is going to work?" Richard asked, his voice sharp, though it was laced with doubt. "All I know is that I've spent years warning people, and no one listened. How do we fix what's already been set in motion?" She didn't turn to him, but he saw the faintest of smiles tug at her lips. "You can't fix it all at once," she said quietly, almost soothingly. But you can change the course. That's all any of us can do. Richard watched as she continued to work, her movements fluid and graceful, as if she were a part of the machinery itself. There was something hypnotic about it, the way she seemed to control the space around her. It was almost as though the place had been designed with her in mind. His chest tightened as he realized how little he truly understood about what was going on. "What exactly is it that you're trying to do?" he asked, this time with a deeper sense of urgency in his voice. He couldn't keep standing in the shadows, waiting for her to piece it all together. He had to know, had to understand. She paused for a moment, her hand hovering over a series of blinking red buttons. The cold, the stalkers, the anomaly, it's all interconnected. A distortion in your world's natural order. If we don't act now, the rest of the planet will fall into a permanent state of freeze. It's not just a sudden climate event. It's a systemic breakdown. The creatures, the temperature drop. They're both symptoms and agents of a deeper cause. Richard shook his head. A deeper cause? What does that even mean? Is it the anomaly? What is it really? She turned to face him then, her skin shimmering faintly in the dim light. Her eyes held something he couldn't place, something ancient, something familiar yet foreign. The anomaly is not of this world, she said carefully, her voice steady. It's an external force, something that shouldn't be here. The cold, it's like a veil, a gateway opening between your world and another. Richard's mind spun as her words sank in. A veil? Between worlds? Yes. Her gaze softened. And the frost stalkers? They're the result of that breach. They are not native to your planet. They're part of the manifestation, part of what happens when the balance of your world is tipped too far. When the anomaly took hold, it disrupted everything, the atmosphere, the magnetic fields, the natural laws of your planet. The stalkers are merely a symptom of that disruption. The air in the bunker felt heavier. Richard tried to piece her words together, but they didn't fit in the world he knew. External force? Another world? His thoughts raced. So, how do we stop it? How do we close the damn veil? His voice was rough, his patience worn thin. I need to understand. I need to know what we're dealing with. Because if you're right, the world is already dead, and I'm just holding on for a few more hours. She stepped closer, her expression softer now, though still distant. You don't understand, she said gently. It's not that simple. If we close the veil, it will stop the cold. But it will also mean the end for those who remain behind in your world. The ones who aren't prepared, they will freeze, they will succumb to the temperature shift. And there's no guarantee your world will survive the transition. Richard's heart slammed in his chest. Then what the hell do we do? We must make a choice, she said, her eyes locking with his. Close the veil and save those who can survive, or let it remain open for a time, and give humanity a chance to adapt to the new world that will be born from it. Richard felt the weight of her words crushing him. Every option seemed like a death sentence. Was there a third choice? One where everyone survived? He wanted to believe there was, but the rational part of him, the scientist, knew there wasn't. The woman's voice softened, a trace of empathy in her gaze. I know it's not an easy choice, but it's one we have to make now. The anomaly won't wait. The stalkers are closing in. The cold is spreading. The veil will pull everything into its grip, and in the end, only those who are ready for the change will survive. Richard's chest tightened. There had to be another way. There had to be. But she was right. The world outside the bunker was already in chaos. He could hear the storm howling through the walls, the distant screeches of the creatures still searching for them. Every minute they wasted, they were one step closer to being caught in the storm's wrath. Do you have any idea how many people are still out there? Richard asked. His voice cracked slightly. How many might still have a chance? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at the panel, her fingers hovering over a sequence of buttons. Then, slowly, she turned back to him. Some, she said. Not many, but a few. I've been watching. I've been monitoring the survivors. There are pockets of hope left. Richard's mind was racing. You said the veil would pull everything into its grip. But if we close it, there's no guarantee we'll even survive. What happens to the planet when the veil is shut? The woman's voice was quiet, almost distant, as she answered, "When the veil closes, the cold will stop. But your world will be changed. It will be altered. The atmosphere, the balance, everything will shift. And the creatures may remain. Even in the absence of the anomaly, they may survive." Richard took a long, shaky breath. "So, it's not just about surviving. It's about what we can live with." She nodded slowly. "Exactly." He rubbed his face, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his shoulders. The future felt as if it were slipping through his fingers, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. How could he make a choice like that? The fate of the world, of humanity, all on his shoulders. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. He looked at her, seeing the resolve in her alien eyes. This was it. This was the moment where everything would either crumble or take a new form. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew one thing for certain. The world was counting on them. They had no choice but to act. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steadying. "Let's close the veil." The woman didn't waste time. With the decision made, her movements were a blur of urgency and purpose. Richard stood to the side, barely able to comprehend the gravity of what they were about to do. The fate of everything hung in the balance. And yet, in that moment, it felt as if he were merely a spectator in someone else's story. Her skin shimmered in the dim emergency lights, almost glowing as she navigated the complex machinery, her fingers moving with swift precision over buttons and levers that Richard could barely begin to understand. She was part of this world, and yet at the same time, she was not. It was as though she had always been a piece of this puzzle, a key that had been waiting to be turned. "Are you sure this will work?" Richard asked again, though he wasn't sure if he wanted the answer. She didn't look up. "It's the only option we have," she said softly. Her voice had a quiet certainty to it that, for some reason, both reassured and terrified him at the same time. "There's no turning back now." The storm outside raged on, a violent cacophony of snow, wind, and an occasional deep rumble, as if the very earth itself was protesting what was happening. Richard could hear the faint howls of the frost stalkers in the distance, their grotesque forms still wandering, looking for their next victim. The walls of the bunker seemed to pulse with tension, the weight of the world pressing down on them from every side. A few seconds later, the alien woman spoke again, her voice barely more than a whisper, initiating the protocol. The machinery around them began to hum to life, the room vibrating with the soft mechanical energy of something far beyond Richard's understanding. There were no loud alarms, no flashing red lights, just an odd, unsettling quiet that settled over everything. It felt as if the world was holding its breath. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as the woman worked. He couldn't help but wonder how much longer the world outside would survive the storm, how much longer they could hold on before everything they knew became unrecognizable. Was there any hope for the rest of humanity? Was it too late? And then it happened. The floor beneath them shook violently, and Richard stumbled, his heart leaping into his throat as the control panel let out a high-pitched whine. The screens in front of him flashed bright, like stars blinking in the void, and then, with a suddenness that almost knocked him off his feet, everything went dark. For a moment, the silence was suffocating. Richard held his breath, praying for something, anything, to happen. He turned to look at the woman, but her figure was only a faint silhouette against the blackness. And then, the wall of the bunker opposite them rippled. It was as though the very fabric of reality had been torn open, a shimmering vortex swirling into existence. Richard's breath caught in his throat. The anomaly had been sealed, but not without leaving a trace. The air around them grew colder, sharper, and Richard could feel the temperature dropping even in the warmth of the bunker. It was as if the breach between worlds had left its mark, a chill seeping into the very bones of the earth. From the shadows, the woman stepped forward, her skin still glowing softly, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she spoke. "We did it. It's done." Richard stood in stunned silence, still feeling the pull of the void in his chest. The anomaly was closed, but at what cost? "You mean?" His voice cracked. "It's over? The cold? The creatures?" "Yes," she said softly, almost as if she were reassuring herself as much as him. For now, the temperature will stabilize. The frost stalkers will disappear, and the balance of your world will return. Richard looked out the small reinforced window. The swirling snowstorm had ceased, the fierce winds quieting into an eerie calm. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the world outside had been frozen in time. But you said the world would change, he said, his voice shaking. What now? The woman turned, her eyes meeting his. Now we wait. The veil may be closed, but the balance is fragile. There will be consequences, even if you don't see them immediately. She was right. The veil had been closed, and yet Richard could already feel the ripple of something new taking shape. His world, the one he had fought so desperately to save, was no longer the same. And he was no longer the same man who had walked into this bunker. The creature's looming presence, the woman's skin, the eerie silence of the aftermath. Everything had shifted, leaving him with a sense of uncertainty and dread. We'll rebuild, he said, his voice steadier now. Whatever happens next, we'll rebuild. The woman's smile grew. Yes, but remember, it's not just about surviving. It's about understanding what we've learned. The true challenge is not closing the veil, but living with what we have opened up. Richard didn't know what the future would look like, what the world would look like, but he knew one thing. The journey wasn't over. It was only beginning. He walked over to the woman, who stood by the control panel, her back straight and proud. Together, they stared at the faint blue glow of the anomaly's remnants, a strange sense of peace settling over them. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Richard felt as if there was hope. And that, for now, was enough.